Let me just quickly introduce our speaker today. It's Dr. Yasmeen Hamza, and she obtained her Ph.D. from Catholic University in Leuven, Belgium, as part of a Marie Curie Fellowship. And while she was there, she was working on speech perception of children with cochlear implants. And she also worked briefly for Cochlear Benelux, the Benelux countries, during her PhD, and completed a postdoc at the University of Rochester before coming here as an assistant professor. Her interests are primarily in integrating her clinical experience, she's an MD as well as a PhD, with research. And her research interests span auditory processing, speech perception, cochlear implants, tinnitus, and relevant to today, aging and cognition. And so without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Yasmeen.
As Professor Neil has mentioned, I'm a newly hired assistant professor, and I just moved from my postdoc at University of California, Irvine, and I'm setting up my lab here. And I thought that this would be a great opportunity to try and introduce my work and what we do here at the Hearing, Speech, and Cognition Lab. So I'll start by giving a little bit of introduction about the work that is intended to happen, the lab, and then I'll be talking more about one of the studies that has been done. So the Hearing, Speech, and Cognition Lab is allocated in the School of Communication Science and Disorders, and this is within this beautiful 6-story building that we have dedicated for our school. And within that building, we have the last 3 floors are for us as professors and labs, but the bottom 3 floors, they house a full functional speech and hearing clinic. And in the basement, we have the hearing clinic, and this is where my research booth is. And then in the 1st and 2nd floor, we have treatment and testing rooms that are within the speech and hearing clinic as well. So this is our location. This is the website for the lab, if you're interested. And within the Hearing, Speech, Cognition Lab, what are our research directions? So we are interested in trying to understand and reduce the challenges that are faced by individuals with hearing disorders. And by hearing disorders, I do not necessarily mean hearing loss. Okay, so the first thing that comes into your mind, those are people who do not have enough audibility. There isn't enough input, but it goes beyond that. It goes to things like ringing in the ear, tinnitus, even if you have normal hearing. It goes into things like auditory processing, where you are perceiving the input, but you're not processing the signal correctly. And by challenges, it's not necessarily your inability to hear, but it goes beyond that. It goes to your speech perception. It goes to your cognition. It goes to how the cognitive abilities can affect your hearing, but also how age-related hearing loss can affect your cognition. Okay, so this is the long-term goal for us. Try to understand the challenges that we are having and try to mitigate them eventually. In order to do that, we first need to identify and characterize the problems, right? So this is what we carry out in the lab. We try to identify what type of problems do people with hearing disorders face. And then we are in the process of developing objective measures that effectively assess and early identify those problems. And by using those objective measures, we are hoping that eventually we're going to be able to advise intervention strategies, evaluate them to improve the speech perception, auditory processing, and cognitive outcomes of those individuals. So what do we do at the Hearing, Speech, Cognition? We are interested in the overlap or the interplay between hearing, speech, and cognition. And this includes the entire spectrum. So it goes from hearing all the way to understanding. And by hearing, we mean the access to the acoustic cue. So anything that is related to audibility, anything that's related to improving the signal to noise ratio up to the acoustics of the room and how you can improve that. That's the hearing. Beyond hearing, in order for you to listen, you need to activate some cognitive functions. You need your prefrontal cortex activate attention, have active listening, direct your attention towards the stimuli that is of importance. And then there's some processing to reach the understanding, which involves more cognitive functions for you to be able to actually extract a meaning or even do some sort of decision making on a certain paradigm. So this is the entire spectrum. And in order to be able to assess this entire spectrum, we run various behavioral tests, we run electrophysiological tests, but sometimes we even revert to modeling. So this is the booth this is the lovely booth that is dedicated to the hearing, speech, and cognition. And it's in our clinic. As I said, it's in the basement. And in that booth, we carry the hearing and speech tests. So it is a sound-treated room, which means that it does not allow access of noise, which is crucial for you to be able to carry out hearing tests. The participants would normally be, can you see my cursor? So the participant would be enlisted from here, and he would be seated where we can see him through the window. And this is one of the tests that we use. It is a pure tone audiometry. So the basic test that we do in hearing is audiometry. And audiometry involves the pure tone audiometry, which is basically that we scan the different frequencies. So over here you have the frequencies, over here you have the intensity, and we scan the different frequencies from 250 hertz up to 8 kilohertz at different intensities and determine at each of those frequencies what is your hearing threshold. Okay, so what is the level at which you are able to identify that you heard that tone 50% of the time, and that would be your threshold. Based on that threshold, we can classify you into being normal hearing, mild hearing, all the way to profound hearing loss. And at my lab, we are very much interested in the entire spectrum. So we are interested in those who have normal hearing, but do have other disorders, all the way to those who have profound hearing loss and are using cochlear implants. So the reason that we, in most times, we use in pure tone audiometry 250 up to 8 kilohertz is this is the frequency range for most of the speech sounds. So if you do a spectrogram of the speech, you will find that most of the important phonemes that are required for your identification or recognition of a word lie within this spectrum. However, more and more studies now are moving in the direction that the extended frequencies from 8K to 20K play an important role as you age in speech perception. If you're interested more in that, I have a preprint that's out there that looks at the representations of certain phonemes at the level of the subcortex, and it does it through a model where we modeled the neural responses if we're going to insert a sound, a speech sound, just till 8 kilohertz versus up to 20 kilohertz. And we found that the accuracy significantly increases if you use the extended frequencies. And this is one of the mechanisms that is being now proposed as why, as we age, our speech perception declines. The other thing that we conventionally do is speech audiometry, because at many times it is important to know where you're defective in terms of hearing. However, it doesn't give us a real life situation, right? So if I know that you're hearing the tone here, there, and there, you don't normally go in life hearing pure tones. It doesn't convey much of a message. So speech audiometry is a much more realistic measure for that. And in that measure, we usually give a list of words that is audible. So it's usually not given a threshold. We make sure that it's given somewhere here. And we just measure your accuracy in telling those words. The next set of tests that we run in our lab is psychoacoustical and auditory processing tests. And psychoacoustical, it refers to identifying those features in the sound that are important for perception, and auditory processing goes beyond audibility. So you can hear it, but what happens at higher levels? There are various tests that can be used. Some of them we're more focusing on, but I'll just give you an idea. One of the things is mono-oral low redundancy, and that is your ability to extract speech from background noise. This involves higher cognitive function. It doesn't only involve attention, but it also involves the efferent pathways in order to be able to kind of smear out the speech sounds from the noise, but also your ability to fill in the gaps. And this involves a lot of intellectual and cognitive function. Dichotic listening, a perfect example of that is, imagine that you're talking over the phone and then your child runs to you to tell you something about his basketball training that day. You would be able to normally perceive both. So you're talking over the phone, whoever is talking to you did not miss that signal, and you were still able to understand the signal that came from the other ear, even though they're interfering, they're not the same. And this is exactly what we do with dichotic listening. Some people have less abilities in that, and it could be indicative of auditory processing disorders. So they cannot focus on both, or they lose the information. And an example of that is the dichotic digit test, where we give different digits to both ears and ask you to report them, or we give the digits in the different ears and ask you to report or focus on only one ear. The other thing is binaural interaction, and this basically measures what is your benefit from hearing by both ears rather than hearing by one ear. This is the gist out of it. If we are allowing the system to get binaural input, what is the benefit there? Temporal measures, and this is a great focus in my lab because temporal measures have been shown to be associated not only with hearing loss, but with aging. So regardless of your hearing loss, it is one of the aging mechanisms, and we believe that it occurs at the level of the brainstem. And it also could be used to indicative of some retrocochlear lesions. So the gap detection test, I'm going to talk about the easier version. This is one test that we implement in our lab, which is the within channel. So basically you hear two sounds, and those two sounds are separated by a gap. This gap keeps getting narrower, narrower, narrower. And the narrowest gap that you can still perceive those two sounds as two sounds is your threshold. Okay, so the smaller the gap, the better the neural coding. The next set of tests that we employ is the electrophysiological tests. And in my lab, we're interested in the auditory evoked potentials, okay? At some point, I would like to involve visual evoked potentials if there are collaborators as a sort of control of some of the sensory input. So what we do with auditory evoked potentials, you can see the setting is very minimal, right? It's not a full headset. It's just that we have one electrode over there. They have two insert phones. They sit back and relax, and we do the recording. And this gives us a better measure of the neural process that is happening. So with auditory evoked potentials, you can get those beautiful waves. You have either the early evoked potentials, mid potentials, or late potentials. And each of those potentials are representative of a certain stage in the pathway of the auditory system. There are advantages of having early versus late potentials. So while the early potentials are not going to give you information about what's happening in the cortex, they tend to be passive, which means if the person is sleeping, if they are non-responsive, populations like ASD, and populations that have intellectual difficulties, ABR is a great measure for that. With late latency responses, you get a benefit, right? You're getting the cortical responses, but it usually involves an active task. Now, what we are showing currently in the lab is that even though ABR does not give you information about the cortical responses, however, disintegrity, neural disintegrity at the level of the cortex could actually be expressed at the level of the brainstem. And so we are in the process of developing an auditory biomarker for cognition that is occurring at an earlier stage that allows you to benefit from the paradigm, the easy paradigm that could be employed clinically on difficult to test populations. So the cognitive tests, so I did the hearing, I did the speech, now we're moving on to the cognitive tests. And the cognitive test conventionally, this is from my previous lab, I'm still setting up my cognitive tests here. Conventionally, we do it in a relaxed environment, and we counsel our patients I just wanted to introduce this picture to acknowledge my previous research assistant at that time, Janie Vu, who's done a wonderful job with the data collection, but also to introduce to you Kyla Rodriguez, who's my current research assistant, who's been doing an incredible job. She is also being trained on all of those batteries, and she's going to be ready to test hopefully next semester. So what type of cognitive tests do? We usually like to do those that are auditory or language-based tests, not only because we are in the auditory domain, but because those have been highlighted as within the hallmarks of ADRD. And by that, I mean episodic memory, so immediate word learning and delayed recall, recognition, your ability to say that this word has been exposed to you previously or not, executive function like animal fluency test, where we tell you to name as many animals as you can within a certain period of time. But we also like to test other domains. So we test executive function in a non-auditory domain to look for if there's any differences. So we use the trail making test. We test attention, working memory, processing speed in a non-auditory domain, and we are currently in the process of introducing it in an auditory domain as well, the digit span test, to be able to do some comparisons, and we do spatial memory tests. We also like to do a visual discrimination test, just to include another sensory modality to see if our findings are specific for the auditory input, or does it also involve other sensory modalities? And visual discrimination is not about visual acuity, so those people are generally corrected. It is placed at a place where the visual input is good. It goes beyond that. It is involving processing and decision-making. Which of those patterns are identical to the one that you have seen? So what am I currently running in the lab? So we are looking at the association between hearing loss, tinnitus, and cognition. And this is the talk I will be presenting in a while, a specific study. We are, as I mentioned, in the process of developing auditory biomarkers for cognitive decline in terms of electrophysiology. And we're also actively looking at the risk of dementia that is associated with tinnitus. So today I will be talking about one specific study that looks into hearing loss, tinnitus, and cognition in the aging population. So in this study, the motivation was that hearing loss has been identified by the Lancet Commission 2020 in a meta-analysis as the #1 modifiable risk factor in midlife. So just by modifying hearing loss, you are expected to reduce the prevalence of dementia by 8%, okay? And this is done through a meta-analysis. There's a lot of ongoing research that is trying to show that it's not just an associative relationship, but it's actually causative. So here is where more and more papers are coming out that says that cochlear implants longitudinally have shown that their cognition is better than those who have not been corrected if everything else is balanced. So we're moving more in that direction. And as you can see here, this is your degree of hearing loss, and this is your hazards ratio. It tells you that the worse your hearing, the higher your risk is of dementia. So how about aging and hearing loss? So we do know that hearing loss is obviously impactful because it is a high risk factor for dementia. It is one of the most prevalent conditions in the elderly. So nearly half of those who are aged 65 to 84 years are going to have some sort of hearing loss. And put in mind, that's only measuring up till the 8K. We frequently disregard the extended frequencies, which could also add more to that. When it comes to tinnitus, it's practically the same. Tinnitus is considered a highly prevalent condition, so it occurs in 10 to 15% of adults. And research says that 50% of individuals are going to get some sort of tinnitus some point of their life, okay? This incidence of tinnitus increases with age. You can already see that there's gender differences, definitely, that you can see, but also with aging process, you are more likely to have tinnitus, just like with hearing loss. And also with your degree of hearing loss, you are at a higher risk of, so this is the worse you're hearing, and this is your odds ratio of having tinnitus. So it is up to, research has shown that it's up to 80% overlap. There are differences in the reporting, but it is up to 80% overlap. And by now you should kind of see where the problem is. So aging results in cognitive decline, and hearing loss is associated with cognitive decline. Hearing loss in itself occurs with aging, and tinnitus is associated with hearing loss, but also occurs with aging. And because of this association, tinnitus has often been deemed as an impairment to cognition. So in this study, what we asked was, does tinnitus really impair cognition, or is it just an association that is happening with hearing loss and aging? And the reason that we say that is because of the heterogeneity of the tinnitus population. So you can get tinnitus at the age of 20 because you're taking a medication that has a central effect. You can get it due to a noise trauma, you're listening to loud music. But the tinnitus that we're talking about is more of a physiological tinnitus. It's happening with aging. So with aging, you're having hearing loss. And this is just part of the graceful aging, as we say. Where do you place the mark? And with that, tinnitus is happening. So our hypothesis was that tinnitus in that specific subgroup is not going to have the same effect on cognition as a person who suddenly woke up with tinnitus at the age of 20. Different pathophysiological mechanisms are implicated. The other thing is the co-founders that are just expressed, hearing loss and aging, the most two important, but also other co-founders that haven't been controlled for in many of those studies. The last thing that we asked is which domains. So while we expect that tinnitus could distract you in terms of your attention, but does it affect something like your episodic memory, one of the hallmarks of ADRDs? We should be able to differentiate that because the risk is not the same. So the aim of this study was to assess the association between tinnitus and cognition in a specific group, the elderly who are aged 60 to 69, and by stratifying them into normal hearing and hearing loss. We adjusted for all of the co-founders that I've just mentioned, and we looked into a global effect, but also into the specific domains that I have just explained. So we looked into episodic memory, we looked into executive function, and we looked into attention, working memory, processing speed, and the global effect. So this study, we obtained the data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey in NIHANS, and we used the cycle of 2011-2012. And this is a survey study that is representative of the US population. And in this sample, we had 643 individuals aged 60 to 69. We broke them down into normal hearing and hearing loss, and we assessed the effect of tinnitus in hearing loss versus the effect of tinnitus in normal hearing. In terms of prevalence, you can already see that 20% of those with normal hearing have tinnitus, whereas around 40% of those who have hearing loss have tinnitus. So already the association is there, right? You can already see that those who have hearing loss have more tinnitus. We ran our multivariable regression models, and in the outcome, we used the 4 tests that I've just explained: executive function, episodic memory, and attention. And we did a Z-score of the 4 tests so that we have a single global outcome performance. And that is indicative of your cognitive performance. We used tinnitus in these models as the predictor. And we broke down the groups into hearing loss and normal hearing, and we adjusted for all of the covariates that I've just explained. And I'd like to share the results. I always like to show the raw data, because if something is there, it shows in the raw data, okay? Before any manipulation. So here's your cognitive performance Z-score. Here's your cumulative frequency of the population. Red means hearing loss, blue means normal hearing, dotted means that you have tinnitus, solid means that you don't have tinnitus. And you can already see that those 3 groups are performing kind of similarly, whereas only this group is kind of lagging behind in terms of cognition. And this group is the group of hearing loss and no tinnitus. So it looks like the group of hearing loss and tinnitus is catching up with the normal hearing peers. That effect of hearing loss is not showing there. And when we controlled for covariates, ran the analysis, that was still the case. Now, as I said, what we concluded was like, oh my God, so hearing loss causes cognitive decline, but does tinnitus prevent it? So we ran post hoc analysis between the 4 groups, and what we found was that the only group that performs statistically significantly lower than the normal hearing is the group with hearing loss and no tinnitus. The group of hearing loss and tinnitus performs equivalently well to the normal hearing peers. When we wanted to calculate an odds ratio, we used the 25th percentile as a criteria of poor cognitive performance. And we saw that in the group of hearing loss, if you have tinnitus, you are 5.6 times less likely to have poor cognitive performance. Whereas if you have normal hearing, it doesn't matter if you have tinnitus or not. It doesn't have a bad effect. It doesn't have a good effect. It's like it's not there in terms of cognition. So the next step for us was, okay, we need to validate that in a second database. Let's look for a second database. And we went to the Hispanic Community Health Study. Now we need to put in mind that this is a different design of study. This is not a survey study. It is rather like a community multi-center study that recruits the Hispanic population. And in this study, we have 1,716, they're aged 60 to 69, and we stratified them in the same way. Now, one of the things I want you to look at that is already expressing differences is that those who are with normal hearing reported 33% of them versus 20% in the NHANES reported tinnitus, but also those who have hearing loss, more than 50% versus 40%. So there is already some differences, and that just happens when you are going to compare different databases. We ran the same regression models. We used the same outcome measure, but of course they're adapted to Spanish, right? So one of the things that you also need to put in mind is some of those tests are not identical. So there's a little bit of a difference in methodology. So even though the other test has like words, they are 10, here they are 15. So maybe your cognitive load is a little bit higher here. In terms of word fluency, they use the animal fluency over there. Over here, they ask them to just name as many as they can that start with a certain letter. Even for the digit symbol substitution test, where you substitute certain symbols for digits, over there they gave them 90 seconds, here they gave them 120 seconds. So there are some differences. However, we ran the same analysis in the same way. Of course, in the covariates, we have to remove ethnicity because everyone is Hispanic. And we went to look at the data. First thing I'll show you is raw data, speaks for itself. So over here is the Hispanic database, and you can already see that the red lines are performing identical and the blue lines are performing identical. So what this says is that hearing loss are going to lag behind normal hearing, regardless of tinnitus. That tinnitus improving effect is not shown here in this database. And that was continuously true when we adjusted for covariates. Now, we did the post hoc analysis to look into the different groups. And yes, once again, tinnitus group is not performing any better in terms of the hearing loss as compared to the normal hearing. If anything, there's kind of a trend here that it's kind of debilitating. It has a negative effect. And so the next thing for us was like, okay, let's go back to the NHANES database. Let's split the NHANES database into Hispanic and non-Hispanic and see if the effect extends only to the non-Hispanic. And this is what we did. So you will see here, this is your non-Hispanic population in the NHANES, and you can see that after removing the Hispanic, the N number has been reduced from 643 to 495, but the significance is still the same. The beta effect size is the same, the P is almost the same, and if anything, your confidence interval is higher. So the effect kind of got a little bit stronger, if we can say that. Whereas for the Hispanic, the effect went away. So here it also showed the same thing as in the HCHS. You will have to take it with a grain of salt because the N number is very small. It's 148. However, it incorporates a previous result. And we did this analysis very directed. We had a hypothesis in mind and we wanted to find out what's happening. So back to the group that could be protected. So the group that is the non-Hispanic. Why would tinnitus be of a good effect for them? Why would it improve their cognitive performance? And this is a question that we had to deal with. What is happening there? So what we thought about is that hearing loss is known to cause tonotopic map reorganization over time. However, recent studies using MRIs have shown that if you have tinnitus in the presence of hearing loss, that tonotopic map reorganization does not happen. So it's like tinnitus is generating that sound that preserves your tonotopicity in the brain and doesn't allow for that reorganization. And a lot of this is going into how the temporal lobe is being reorganized to involve other sensory modalities, right? So it seems that with tinnitus, this is not happening. And a finding in our study that was consistent with that was that the longer your tinnitus duration, the better was your cognitive performance. So it means that over time, that tonotopic effect continues and continues and continues. It continues to be protective of it. The other thing is that you can think, it's not one of the other, but you can think hearing loss is going to reduce your auditory performance one way or another. And this could be a result of why you are performing poor on the auditory related cognition, right? So things like the CIRAD, the word list, things that are very specific to the auditory domain. And a study from my previous lab has shown that if you have tinnitus after adjusting for hearing loss, it doesn't appear that you are performing more weakly in tasks like speech and noise, gap detection, so on and so forth. So tinnitus does not have a negative effect in that sense. And it could be that tinnitus is preventing that auditory-related cognitive decline. This is particularly of relevance in our study because we found that the specific domain that brought about the cognitive importance, the cognitive performance, was the CIRAD word learning. So it is the word learning list, okay? So it is episodic memory. So the tinnitus is improving the episodic memory. It's not worsening the other domains, attention or the working memory or the speed, but it's improving the episodic memory. And what we were thinking is that, so that auditory related cognition is important for social engagement. So if your auditory related cognition as a result of the reduced auditory performance is poor, then you are likely to be less socially engaged, which has already been shown to be associated with poor cognitive performance. So if you think about it, tinnitus is preventing that tonotopic map reorganization, which is resulting in that improved auditory performance, which will eventually result in good social engagement. So what we concluded from this study was that if you have hearing loss, tinnitus is associated with better cognition in the elderly, at least in the non-Hispanic population. However, we need to take it again with a grain of salt because this is only an associative study. So what we are doing now currently in the lab is that we are running a case control study that looks into the effect of tinnitus in hearing loss versus non-hearing loss, and it's controlled. But we're also looking into the ethnicity effect, and this is where I submitted a FIA for the study. And ethnicity is of great importance because what we are thinking is that maybe for the Hispanic population, their social cultural factors are allowing them to be socially engaged. So they do not need tinnitus in order to be able to perform better in cognition. They are compensated through social cultural factors, through support groups. So this is where the hypothesis is for this study. We also need more brain imaging and electrophysiological studies. And as I've mentioned, we have been working on the auditory evoked potentials. And we are in the process of developing an auditory biomarker for cognition. For the future work, we would like to look at if tinnitus is really good for you. Does this mean that people who do not have hearing loss, or that have hearing loss but no tinnitus, would tinnitus simulations improve them and make them perform equivalently? This requires a clinical trial, so something to look for in the future. But also the other side of the coin, which is if you have tinnitus, would treating your tinnitus make your cognition any worse? So this brings me to the end of the talk, a few acknowledgements there, and I'll open the floor for questions.
Thank you so much. Okay, so finishing very promptly, and we definitely have time for questions. One want to lead off?
I had two quick questions. So The result is kind of very interesting. It sounds like, because I'm not familiar with tinnitus, so it sounds like a little bit counterintuitive. So I guess my first question is like, was the result, what are the messages should we tell like people? People with hearing loss, people with tinnitus, they already like suffer. This is like bad experience. Like with this result, what kind of message should we tell our patient with tinnitus? Should we say, okay, you're good, you may have a better cognitive function? Like I was thinking about how to frame this result in terms of like convey the
clinical
message to
application.
people. Yes.
That's a great question, Long. And the first thing is to realize, so as you were saying tinnitus is bad, it's going to impair your cognition. So this is the general perspective in the field. And tinnitus is not bad. Tinnitus is bothersome in 5% of those who have tinnitus. Okay, so it's only those 5% who are going to suffer. It's only those 5% that are going to have an impact on their life. 95%, they're not going to have bothersome tinnitus. Okay, that's the first thing. Okay, and the second thing is that we as researchers accept that there are different underlying pathophysiologies, because tinnitus is one of those things that we cannot put our hand on what is happening, right? There are different theories, peripheral versus central versus the interplay between both. And we need to accept that it's not a single mechanism serves all. And this will push the direction of research differently, because maybe we just want to focus on those 5% where it impairs them and look at the underlying pathophysiology of those 5% and remediate those 5%. And this is where it's important to identify the problem. Whereas for the other 95%, we might actually think that, no, it's good for you. And actually, those who do not have tinnitus but have hearing loss, we can learn something from you and try to improve their cognition by doing tinnitus simulations. So the output of this research was just to push into the field that the general idea of that tinnitus is bad. We cannot just say tinnitus is bad. We have to understand that it's very variable and various things are happening, and we need to accept it before we're able to actually modify and work on the remediation.
Thanks. I guess the message I'm getting from you is like, tinnitus give us this bad experience, but maybe some aspect of this tinnitus is not bad, right? That's like a fair summary of what you said.
I would say it is fair, but again, I'm taking everything very, as I said, this is an associative study, and while it makes sense to me as a person who likes to do a holistic approach, that it is happening for a reason. With everything that with aging happens for a reason, right? So it makes sense that it could be our brain adapting. So yes, so I think that it's important to just put a pillar or like a flashlight that let's just remove that stigma of tinnitus is bad and start breaking it down into different categories and looking for who is it bad for, who is it good for. Okay,
thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you, Long, for being here.
Let me kind of piggyback on that first question. Was there a way to look within that sample at whether or not the tinnitus was reported by the individual as very bothersome or not?
There is. I did not share it for the purpose of time, but we showed that duration was the only one factor that had a positive effect, and severity had no effect. So the severity was not an aspect of effective cognition. Take it with a very, 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 like take it with a lot of salt, not a grain of salt, because those who had bothersome tinnitus were 5 individuals. Okay, and that's just representative of the population of tinnitus, right? So you have 150 something who have tinnitus, but only 5 are reporting it as bothersome. But and that's what I'm trying to say, future studies need to focus on certain populations. So if you're gonna want to see the effect of bothersome tinnitus and cognition, you're gonna get something out of it that is different than just taking people who have tinnitus. People who have tinnitus with age-related hearing loss is different than tinnitus who have noise exposure. And you're likely to find those to have more bothersome tinnitus than those who are age-related. So we need to try, and tinnitus is like headache. And it has, in terms of symptomatology, if you think about it, headache could be due to various causes, and you can't just generalize the effect of it without the underlying cause.
Okay, appreciate that response. Other questions that people might have? Well, let me follow up then on your response to the last question. You talked about duration as being a potentially important variable. And can you say a little bit more about how duration operated?
So again, here was just there's again, this is not one of the major things that I highlighted for various reasons. One of them is duration was given to them in terms of less than a year to 4 years, 5 to 9 years, and more than 10 years. Okay. Now, even though you're going to control for age, it's still that your longer duration is most probably going to be associated with age. It's still something that it's going to be reflected there, right? So if you do think about it. And the ideal way to do it is to be able to tease out the cause of hearing loss, which we were not able to do in this study because of its nature. So I'd like to tease out age-related versus the more pathological conditions. So this is just one of the things that comes with the nature of the study that we had. It's a good sample, a good start, but this is why it's important to have a case control study. And this is what we're doing currently in the lab in order to be able to answer this question more in detail, and the effect of severity, the effect of the duration, and the effect of frequency. Because if you have tinnitus once every month, it's different than having tinnitus almost all the time. And believe it or not, sometimes it's the opposite effect. So people who have tinnitus almost all the time kind of get adapted to it because the brain learns to suppress it. Whereas for those who get it every now and then, when it comes, it's very bothersome for them because they're also associated with the anxiety of, is it going to stay? Is it going to go? Is it getting louder? So you implicate the limbic system, and then it kind of gets worse. So a lot of future work needs to be done at the different aspects, and each of those categories needs to be handled individually.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Other questions? All right, well, let me go out on a limb here and try to probe the extent of this. So you're focusing on hearing capabilities and the impact of tinnitus. And I'm wondering whether there are any other associated mediators here. Like, did they have other sensory deficits?
Yeah.
I wouldn't expect a lot of cross-talk between, say, vision and hearing, or touch sensitivity and hearing. But aging generally tends to weaken lots of different perceptual systems. And
I agree.
So
I agree totally, and that's why I wanted, with the first thing I said, I want to include collaborations with the visual domain, because I feel that and this is the feel of most people in the field, is that Patrick, you need to mute your.
I'll mute him.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So that hearing at the end of the day is part of neuroscience, right? So for so long, the hearing field has been dissociated for some reason, right? So that crossover is not like vision or other sensory modalities. And this is what we're trying to do, especially with the after the Lancet Commission, right? That integration that's being happening, because a lot of the focus has been about hearing restoration. And once that has reached a plateau, which we are at the moment with cochlear implants and hearing aid technologies, it went beyond that. It went into listening efforts. It went into not just hearing, it went into your cognitive decline, so on and so forth. And it went into the cross modality, as you are saying. So part of the, so the temporal lobe because of the reduced auditory input, it is proposed that the tonotopic map reorganization happens. And what we were saying is that that mostly affects the episodic memory, because that's where the episodic memory lies, versus that it wouldn't affect the attention. And they're showing that the reorganization happens with cross modalities. So with hearing loss, actually more and more modalities are going to take over that area. And this puts us into the question of, will this be reflected in cognition? So would auditory domain cognitive function be worse but compensated in the visual domain, and that we're not really measuring the cognitive decline, we're just measuring a domain effect? And this is why it's important to also include different domains when we are testing. With regards to tinnitus, this is a great question, because also tinnitus is highly associated with things like migraine, right? So like 30% of those who have migraine are gonna have in their aura some sort of flashes, other sensory symptoms, and they're gonna have the tinnitus at that time. And when they answer the question, they don't tell you that they have it with migraines. They just answer that it happens. So definitely there is crossover, and this is interesting to move forward with.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Other questions from people listening in? If not, then we'll give you back a little bit of your afternoon, and end about 10 minutes early. And I want to thank Yasmeen for a really stimulating and very interesting presentation of your research in this area, attempting to link up tinnitus, cognition, hearing.
Thank you so much, Neil, for the opportunity. I appreciate it. And if anyone who you pass on the recording to has questions, please feel free to reach out to me.
I will definitely do that. Okay, thank you again. And hope
Thank
to see
you.
you at, we have another brown bag coming up end of the month, and there'll be information about that sent around fairly soon. Thanks again.